Okay, so the JavaScript promise. Let's remind ourselves, what is this mechanism used for? Why do we want promises? Why do we have them? What do they help us handle? To do what? Yeah, it's for anything for asynchronous code. What is asynchronous code? I guess a higher level question of that is how many lines of code does JavaScript run at any given time? One at a time, from top to bottom. Sometimes we make requests or something that will not be done immediately, and we don't want our program to pause. So, such as like an Axios request, we send a request out, but it's not going to be immediately for the next line of code to run. So the XHR object was at first used, and now promises are used with that so that our code can keep running, and as soon as the request or whatever the asynchronous operation is done, it's put back into the thread and executed. So it's still being executed in a synchronous manner, but only once it's come back. So really we have two lines of code running at once. One of them is waiting, the other ones are executing. And promises are the most common way to handle this in JavaScript. How do I make my own promise? If I wanted to create a promise right now, how would I do it? It's not. No, we can use promises in those, but. So we'd say, well, promise is a constructor function. So how do you instantiate a constructor? New promise. But it's not one of those ones that returns something. Well, it does, but what does a promise immediately return? What kind of promise? Let's look. Let's console log my promise. And we get a promise back. Wonder if we have to console. It's not giving us exactly what we want to see, because what it actually is a pending promise. So promises can be one of three states: pending, resolved, or rejected. All promises start off as pending. That means the request or something has gone out. So what it immediately returns is a pending promise. So if we're using promises just on their own, we'll typically never say const variable equals because we don't need the pending promise. There are reasons to do this, and with async await, we'll actually be using this syntax. But by default, you'll just create a promise. It gets a callback function that gives you two other functions, resolve and reject. And depending on what the promise does, you either want to resolve it saying things went well, or you want to call reject and say things went poorly. So if I call resolve, let's say I do an Axios request and the promise resolves, what is going to fire, the .then or the .catch? .then. So a resolve means things went well, let's .then and keep moving along. If it's rejected though, something went wrong or something happened that we didn't account for, this is going to show up as the error in our .catch. So that's why any function that returns a promise gets a .then and a .catch. If I put this in my own function, I said this returns a promise, I can call my function, and it's going to get a .then and a .catch. And we typically split these on their own lines so they're easier to look at, but this is what we're going to see. So my question is if I were to run this right now, which one of these is running, the .then or the .catch? The catch, how do we know it's the catch? I'm rejecting. So error in this case is whatever I'm rejecting. So it's actually giving us high. But if I reject you know, whoops, stop, a big error, or I will dot then a success. Can't read property dot then. Oh, I'm not returning my promise. Here we go. There we go. So I get error. This function gets its own dot then dot catch because the function immediately returns a promise and it's pending. So you have to include a dot then and a dot catch afterwards. So once the pending is over, we can handle the outcome. I change this to resolve. We'll now get success. Right, so that is the basic setup of a promise, how it works. And you can use promise-based, asynchronous-based things with your own functions as long as your function returns a promise, your function gets a dot then and a dot catch. We're just used to using it with pre-built functions like Axios. Right. They all start as pending, and then once it's either resolved or rejected, that promise is permanently in that status. In order to do another request, you have to return a new promise or call the function again so a new promise is made and runs the code over again. But yeah, you can never revert from a resolve or a reject. All right, so any questions on the basics of promises? That is their setup. Yeah, these are methods of the promise constructor. And it's because we're returning something immediately. I can't say, you know, const result equals my func, because if I console logged result, I should get a pending promise. My function immediately returns a promise, but it hasn't finished yet. So it says the thing you returned is pending. And then the promise resolves and we get the resolution, whatever was passed through the resolve function. Well, here. Yeah. Any other questions on that? Take some playing with. Will be a pending promise. So we call dot then or dot catch to make sure once it's done, we can handle it. And if I resolved the word success here, the response to my dot then received is whatever was passed into the resolve. So if I console log res, I'll still see success. And if I reject that and console log error, now this is success. It's kind of misleading. I'd reject error. I'd get error right here. Okay. Pending is because I said store whatever my function returns in a variable and console log that variable. Well, my function immediately returns a promise, which is always starting off as pending. So this will always be pending. If we're using the syntax, we need the dot then to figure out, did it resolve or reject? And what is the data that came along with that? Well, it's whatever was passed in to resolve or reject. Okay, so promise chaining. Promise chaining is a technique used if you need to make multiple asynchronous requests synchronously. So I need to make a GET request to our URL, and after that comes back, I need to do another GET request. So that second GET request or that third GET request should only be done when the subsequent ones, or the ones before it, have finished. So what we're going to use for this is the Swappy API. It is the Star Wars API, if we recall that from long before. And instead of requesting to people, I'm just going to request to their base URL and see what we get. Okay, so my response comes back as this object. It has a .data. And in the .data, what do we have? Come on. What did this API send back to us? An object, but what is data? What, can we use anything in here in our app yet? Yeah, these are this when I request the base URL, what it sends me back is all the main endpoints they provide. So you can make if you extend the endpoint to films, you'll get an array of the films, people, planets, and so forth. So this is an example of making a request to make another request. The API sends you back other endpoints, and then you can use those. So let's say our request to this was really to get to the people. Maybe we saved all these in state, but then we need to immediately do a request to people and have something load for the page. And that's in response.data.people. So I'm going to open up this .then. And just so we can follow it, I'm going to say const people equals response.data.people. So we've saved that URL. Now, usually we'd set state here and we're done, but we need to do another request. So what we have to do in this .then is return what we need for the next request. So I'm going to return this URL, right? This is the people URL. And because I returned something from a promise, it creates a new promise with a new .then. So let me console.log res here and see what we get. People. So in a .then, if whatever you return will be the response of the next .then. You're passing it forward so you can do another request only once this is done. Right, go do this request, then give me the data, return it, and then go request again. So I can open this up and say, now axios.get to people, and that's the URL. Now the first inclination would be to say, great, and then .then get that response. But this is called promise chaining hell because this promise has not been resolved, and by putting .then in here, we're creating another promise inside of it. So the first request is the only one that gets its own .then. From then on, we just return what we need for the next request and .then to get it and do something with it. Meaning, I need to return this request to get my next .then with my response. If I console log response now here, people is not defined. Oh, right, it's I called it res. This is this URL, so I'm gonna say res here. Now we're console logging this response, right? It's in the third .then. This has a response.data.results. That is all of our people. Yeah, found me. Yeah, exactly.
Basically, you're just creating
synchronous, asynchronous requests, right? This one won't happen until this one's completed, come back, returns the data we need for the next thing, and then it does the next request. So we're doing asynchronous operations, but they're only happening once the previous one is done. And then we have one final .catch. So if any of these break, this .catch will end the process, catch the error, and let us know, did it break here, did it break here, and so on. So now with this response, we'd end up maybe setting state with it. And this is just convention, right? RES. Since I'm returning people from here, I'd actually probably call this people to know what I'm using. Return the people, then with the people, do a request to the people, return the response, and then catch that response and show me. Now, how nice is this to look at, though? It's a little gnarly. Now, you still want to know that this exists, and if you're asked to do it, know how the functionality works. And the big thing is, again, only the first request gets its own .then, and then it's .then to .then. As long as you're returning, the next then will receive it and can use it. Yeah, so let's say on the back end, we're doing a request to, because Axios is just like saying to-do.find in Mongoose, they're asynchronous. So let's say in order to find the books, we first needed to find the author, get their ID, and then do a request to the books to find all of the books by that author. We could say Axios or friend or author.find and do our request. And then when the response comes back, we could return it and then go get the person's books with that author's info. But it looks a little ugly. Let's see if we can replicate it here. This is not what I wanted. Is it? Here it is. So here's like our author and book app we were looking at. And we were getting the author ID through the parameters, which works just fine. But let's say we wanted to first find the author in the database, grab their ID that way, and then say books.find. Well, just like we're doing the callback function here, this could be a .then and a .catch. It's another way to handle it. So I'm kind of squeamish to show it this way before we do async await. It's going to make it more complicated, where async await is going to make it look so much prettier. So if we're okay with that. This is a real world example though. A lot of APIs will send you back an object of URLs. It doesn't send you the data immediately. You do a request to get the URLs, and then you do a request to one or multiple of the URLs to get data. A lot of APIs are structured this way.
So you like keep adding on favorite color.
Yeah, like this one is for people. I could then do another request to get all the URLs, and then do a request to the films, and then the spaceships, and all the other endpoints they have. So this could be a .then, 10 lines down, 10 .thens. But yeah, it's a lot of extra code to set up this, like, just to make sure that this only happens once this is done. There should be a cleaner way of doing this. And that's when async await was introduced, to make something like this a lot easier to handle. Yeah, so async await's main purpose, no. Wait for it. Don't do it. Async await's main purpose is to make the handling of asynchronous events in a synchronous order prettier, easier to handle. Events in a synchronous way, much easier syntax than promise chaining. So if we want to do the same thing with async await, we'd have to do it in a function, but let's look at this. So let's put this in a function so we can get, this would be for get Star Wars people. And we could call this function whenever we need to get our Star Wars people. Let's do the same thing, but with async await. So there's two parts of this. First, you have to declare what is asynchronous. So I have to say this function is going to have asynchronous operations in it. And the way I do that is I say async function. I put the word async in front of it. If this was a function expression like const myfunc equals fat arrow, I would put the async word right here. So async is before the word function if it's a declaration. It's before the parameters if it's an expression. And this it's a part of JavaScript. Yeah. So if I was not doing the ES6, it would still be right here. It's just before the function declaration. So once you've told a function that it's going to have asynchronous operations, you can then use the await keyword inside of it to await asynchronous operations. So I'm going to declare a variable called response, set it equal to axios.get, that same URL, the base URL that gives us all the other URLs. Now, what would response be right now? What does a promise immediately return? Pending. So right now with this syntax, this is a pending promise. We can't use it. We'd have to .then or .catch. You can use it in some cases, but for our intents and purposes, this isn't going to work. But if we now add the await keyword before our request, this is the response from the dot then. We don't need a dot then because this is only going to be saved once this is done, because the await keyword is going to wait to assign this variable and once this is done. So let's console.log response and then call our function. Get S1 SW people async. So now response is our data. It's not, nested in a dot then like this. And notice line 35, is it running before or after line 34 is complete? After, which means our code is actually pausing here, or it's pausing right here. It's not even going to line 35 until it's resolved and then showing, where if we tried to console log anything in here before it's not in the dot then, it'd be undefined or it'd be pending. So this is great, it's pausing, then it's running. Well, what part of the response do I want? Let's say I want to do people and planets. So there's a response.data.people and the response.data.planets. I could then say, great, go grab the people by awaiting an axios.getRequest to response.people. And then go get the planets by awaiting a request to response.planets. Planets. And then we'll console log people and we'll console log planets. Cannot read property protocol of undefined. I got one of these wrong, I believe. Oh, sorry, it's response.data. .data.people, response.data.planets. Okay. And then both requests came back. Here is my people, and here are my planets. Now, if I were to do this with promise chaining, it'd be a get request the URL, return it, get the people, return it, get the planets, return it, and chaining these dot thens, where this is doing all that for you. I just say, wait for this request. When it comes back, save the response here. Then wait for this request. When it comes back, save the response here. Then again, and I could do as many of these as I need in a row, and they will still happen synchronously. Because I said this is an asynchronous function that should await asynchronous events. Any questions on the syntax up to this point? Do we like this syntax more? Sure, if you say so. If you say it's good.
The other one is more imperative, so I guess.
This, yeah, this is way more imperative. It's way more step by step. Async awaits, declarative, asynchronous handling. Yeah. Right? This is like do 3 requests in a row and then let's set state all at once. Right? I don't have to go get the data, save people, and go get the data, then save planets. I say go get all the data, let's set state once and save it all at one time. Okay, well, what am I missing from this that we usually need with a promise? So our dot then is being handled with the await. What don't we have though? Catch. What if something goes wrong here? What if our endpoint is wrong? We won't get anything. A console log people, and it doesn't even make it that far. Because what's happened is this has thrown an error, and there was nothing there to catch it. So do you remember the standard JavaScript error handling keywords? There's 3 of them.
Yes.
Try, catch, and finally. So if you're using async await, we need to use those words to catch any possible errors. So we'd say, try the following code. Try these requests. If anything goes wrong in any of them, catch the error and handle it. Oops, catch the error and then handle it. So slightly different syntax than the dot catch, right? It's a function that catches and then does something with it. But if we're using async await, we want to wrap it in a try catch, so we're handling the error. It doesn't bubble up and destroy our program. It gets caught and handled right here. So now if we break the URL, let's see what if this catches something. Let's go to /PO instead of people. And then let's actually call our function so we can see it. Okay, get on request failed with the status code of 44, line 40. It's letting us know it caught the error. Without this catch though, now it's just saying you didn't use catch with the try, so let's get rid of the try and the catch and see what an unhandled error looks like. It's pretty similar, but breaks the program. Ours, once it's handled, does not. Okay. People.data.results.
And also, so it doesn't break the program, also play something to the user.
Yeah, that's what you typically would do. We wouldn't just console log it. We'd save that. We'd have a set state here that saves our error in state, so we could then make it show up on the page to the user. So now this is a function that goes and gets data and then returns an object with the .people and a .planets from the database. So when I call this function, I can say const data. If I wanted to return it for some reason, once it's done, oh, it gave us a pending promise. What's happening here? Oh yeah, because it's an asynchronous function. Ignore that for now. We're going to set state anyways. But let's look at this in React and on the back end just briefly to see how you could use the syntax in your project if you wanted to, especially if you have to make multiple requests. So, wrong page, right page. Here is our book router, for example. Here's our books.get, where it gets all of our books. This is asynchronous. This is having to go talk to the database. And this is just like a .then. It calls this function once it resolves, and it gives either the error or the books through it. So we can await this. Well, what is the asynchronous function? Where do we have to put the async word to make sure we can await this? So this is the asynchronous function. So we'd say async here. Because we did that, I'm just going to comment this out so we can see the other version now. We can say const, we'll say response for now, equals await book.find. This will bring back the books if it went well. That's what this response will be. So then we could say return res.status 200 and .send the response. Or if we change this to books, say books. But what aren't we handling? Error. So what do we need? Try catch. So try this query for the books. If it goes well, great. Get them and send them. If it goes poorly, catch it. And that's where we'll do this. Let's test this and make sure this GET request still works. Stay open. Okay, we're connected to the DB, so we should be able to do a GET request to /books and still get all of our books. There we go. A lot of buy beef. So two different ways to write this. We can use async await, declare the function as asynchronous, then await asynchronous events. Now book.find will always return all books, but what can I add to that to find a subset? I don't want to find all books. I want to find all books, books by a specific author.
Yeah.
Yeah, you give it that filtering object. That still works the same. You just don't have to then say comma and then come back with either an error or books. That's being handled with the try catch now. So one more just to see it, we'll do this one. Because this one looks way more complicated, right? Find when update needs a whole bunch of parameters and then comes back with a response. Well, we know we're going to need a try catch, so we'll start with that. Okay. Now we need to do a book.findWhenUpdate. So we'll say this is an asynchronous function. And this is the updated book if things go well, equals book.findOneAndUpdate. Well, it needs these three parameters. That doesn't change. So first, find it by this ID. Next, what to update it with, we're going to do a $ increment. Increment the likes by 1. And then we want the new one back. So the parameters are the same way. We feed it into the function, but we don't have to do this portion. Well, we still do, but it's not as a part of this call. We wait for this to come back and return our status and send the data. Does this look prettier than this? I don't know. Different syntax. But if we need to do multiple updates, multiple books, well, great. We could send back multiple IDs and do multiple requests at once. And then we maybe swap that out for an update many, but you can do multiple queries because of the syntax. And that's really it for async await. Yeah, I'll put these in notes. Any questions though on why we just looked at that? Why is it helpful? No? Okay, there's nothing then. We'll